Amedama is an indie game that was developed by Dyxnt Games, who also published this title. Amedama was also co-developed by Acquire, a game development studio who is responsible for giving us the infamous classic series such as Tenchu, Way of the Samurai, and also the Shinobi series. Games that if you was around during the PlayStation 1 and 2 heyday, you will intimately kinda understand their impacts. Now if you wasn't around to grasp the importance of that era, you may be familiar with their more recent and notable RPG games. One being the popular Octopath Traveler, which they worked closely with Square Enix, home of the Final Fantasy franchise. Now I want you to remember this because its influence are going to come up later within this review. Anyway, I will be rocking out with the PlayStation 5 version, so let's get into it. The story of Amedama takes place in a seemingly old rainy feudal Japan setting. It's here we meet Yushin, a young man who runs an umbrella shop along with his sister Yui. Not to sound like a stereotypical ghost story, but on one stormy night, a group of men paid them a visit and they weren't there because of the umbrellas. Apparently, somebody with a lot of power has orchestrated for Yui to be abducted. Who and for what purpose? That is what our main character Yushin has to figure out. Unfortunately, it's not in life, but in death that he will find his answers and discover that the interwoven web of events and people involved goes a bit deeper than what he initially realized. So the mission is to rescue Yui and figure out why it was done and by who. How exactly is he going to do this? By possessing bodies as a spirit and reliving the same week like it's Groundhog Day to get to the bottom of things. Amedama's presentation from a visual standpoint seems to contain the heavy influences that the game developing studios Acquire has done with their previous titles that I stated before within the introduction. This game takes place somewhere within Edo, Japan and during that timeline, essentially dealing with warriors of that era, which one can arguably say is somewhat reminiscent of Tenchu. Specifically, I'm talking about the ones on the PS1, seeing as though the graphics here kinda looks like it may have come from the PS1 game in terms of the buildings and environment. Some of the effects in the back and foreground share a certain level of realism that is quite gorgeous, such as the rain and water effects. The character designs possesses this sprite-like quality, whereas one can see the pixels that shapes proportionate human beings, and alongside their outfits. This form of presentation kinda reminds me of what was done within those Octopath Traveler games with this 2.5D appearance. One may assume that due to these characters looking blocky that they will move kinda stiff. But quite on the contrary, whenever these people move, it's very smooth within their motions. I mean, it's all the way down to the point where the player can literally see the clothes move with such elegance, which is quite remarkable. The last thing I want to mention is that when an enemy is defeated, blood always gushes out like it's confetti. One last thing I want to talk about as far as the presentation is concerned are these segments where there's like this overlay which delivers this vintage look. It's almost as if I'm watching one of those old VHS flicks, but overall, the presentation looks pretty awesome. Amedama is what some would consider a mini sandbox side-scrolling action game, where the player is seen being engaged within combat, doing fetch quests, and interacting with the denizens of this game setting to progress the story forward. I'll break down the major aspects of Amedama's game cycle, beginning with the movement and how one must maneuver. The player has the ability to move about by walking up and down this almost isometric plane, and can also run at the expense of using up this blue bar, which is like your stamina meter. When engaging in combat, the player can also use up the stamina meter by quickly stepping away to evade and also blocking attacks. But please keep in mind that when you're within this blocking stance, you use up the stamina, and when it's fully depleted, you will be left vulnerable to any onslaught your enemy wants to apply to you. As far as your offense capabilities, you will be utilizing a variety of weapons based on the character the player controls. You have swords, hammers, kitchen knives, and more with the ability to do light and heavy attacks and also jump kicks. You can also string combos together and do special attacks, but again, it all depends on the entity that you play as. But why is that? Well, enter this game's unique and cornerstone gimmick. You see, after the first few minutes, you really don't have a body of your own. Instead, you're just a soul possessing bodies around your environment who are easily influenced or close to death. If they are, you can hit them and evict their original souls for you to move into their bodies. Now, where do the original souls go? Don't know and really nobody cares, as harsh as that sounds. But anyway, before you jump into somebody's body, each vessel will have their own individual strengths, weaknesses, stats, special techniques, and privileges. For example, one body may be faster and another one may be slower, and one may be able to grant such advantages which will allow you to avoid conflict. Good example, I remember walking past a certain area with rogue samurais walking around, and on sight they came after me, but when I walked past them in a similar body, they just pretty much gave me the pass. Even if I tried agitating them, they wouldn't even do anything. At the top of the screen above the stamina bar is your health. When this drops to 0 after a defeat, your soul will be ejected out of the body and you will be left to wander until you can find a new host. This gaming mechanic is kinda awesome because it essentially gives the player multiple opportunities to defeat a foe. However, the issue is that if the body that you was in possessed an advantage such as increased speed or damage, all of that goes away. But you can get those certain perks again via eating food or drinking something at your local shops by spending money. Speaking of money, you can get currency by defeating opponents who will just drop coins. And also, you can play this minigame where you gamble by rolling dice. The closer to the middle of this gauge you get, the better the chances. Now, you are probably wondering what this number at the side of the screen is. This is your soul glow. This number goes down the more lives that you take, and when it hits 0, your soul can no longer reside in the body because it will be considered quote-unquote burnt out. How you can replenish this or bring this number back up to 100 is by going into a different body. Another aspect of Amedama is, of course, is pretty much the exploration in terms of story. One thing that I can say about this game is that its world is very small and makes it impossible for you to get lost. Not to mention, you have a map that you can look at if you do. In terms of the story, to keep the player from getting lost as to where to go next, this blue arrow will appear to point you in the right direction. While traversing, you will come across these souls who have unfinished business, which will lead you to side quests. If you choose to do them, it will grant you an item that will help you reduce the soul glow by a little. Another form of side quest comes in the form of playing as another character doing segments where you play through their memories. This is pretty good in fleshing out characters' backstory and expanding the game's world. And again, if you look at the map, it quickly becomes noticeable how compacted this world is. It's almost like the size of a Persona game. You only have a handful of areas to move through, and you should get used to them because you're going to be seeing them over and over again. Reason being is what I mentioned earlier in the story segment when I said that playing this is like planning a movie Groundhog Day, but instead of a day, it's a whole entire week. At the end of the week, the player will get glimpses of all the events and clues that were experienced within that cycle, and then back to day one again. All the events occur the exact same way, but since each cycle teaches the player more about what is going on behind the scenes, leading to the abduction of Yui, we use that knowledge to create new paths leading to new plots unforeseen. When you go into the pause menu, you can pull up this chart. This shows the events in various timelines and their branching paths leading to different ends. The player will create new branching paths based on the choices the player makes as their top priority. Another main criticism that I have towards Amedama, other than the backtracking, is kind of what infuriated me the most, and it's the fact that the fluidity of the characters is definitely reminiscent of the PS1 era and feels outdated. I say this because of the lack of speed and recovery when you get hit. Let me give you an example. To my old heads in gaming, you'll get this, but I guess the new generation may not, to a certain degree. Alright, so if you don't know that there is a game called Taken, which is arguably the premier fighting game known worldwide, but before it became the juggernaut that it is today and before it actually hit its stride, it was, in my opinion, horrible. I'm talking about Taken 1 and 2, whereas if you get knocked down, it'll take forever in the day for them to get themselves back up again. It'll be cool if in Amedama there was a way to do so, but there isn't. What makes it even worse is that while you're on the ground, you're still being hit. I remember there was one boss that made me want to drive a controller through my television set. She was annoying. She would hit you one time, and while I'm frantically hitting the block and evade button, my character is just standing there in a daze, and before anything else happens, she follows up with more hits, and before I know it, it's all over. And that was just on normal. But because of this game's tendency, I strongly recommend you not to find yourself in any corner, and also to take your time when facing off multiple enemies and to create some space. If not, you better prepare to become a piñata. But other than those two things, this game is remarkable within its own right, and it can be fun if you are looking for an interesting story to dive in. Amedama's sound design is pretty good, especially when it comes to the combat. The sounds of slash and steel when blocking, the gushing of blood when the final blow is dealt, and the sound of the ever-present soothing sound of rain makes this game very memorable. Actually, when I first booted up this game and heard this old guy doing an introduction to this game's story via what sounds like an old tale, let me know that the experience that I'm gonna be in for is going to be authentic. Little did I know that this would be the only very few times that I pretty much would hear dialogue being fully heard verbally. Throughout the rest of the game, when trying to converse with others, the only thing you will hear is one sound effect like a laugh or a grunt, while the text is about 20 times what is heard. But it's not only in dialogue when you hear like this short funny little sounds that the characters will make, it's also heard when you pretty much, kick them around a little bit. The music for Amedama was done by Yoko Kamiyama, who apparently used to work for Capcom and is also the music composer responsible for a lot of the Monster Hunter and Mega Man games. Amedama's 15-song original soundtrack features some of the most calming and exciting tunes that is founded and rooted within the culture that inspired it. In the game, whenever a boss appears with the introduction before a fight, I would always hear this epic song swelling up before the battle. And hearing this tune play whenever a heartfelt moment occurs, is something that pretty much won't escape my mind after hearing them. But you don't gotta take my word for it. I'll provide links in the description so you can check it out for yourself. Amedama is a very unique game in which I would call a whodunit mystery. One of the major strengths of this game is the world building, introduction of characters, and how the information you receive just constantly stacks upon top of each other with each week cycle. The gameplay is very simple, the visuals looks appealing, however it's the backtracking that may become mundane. Luckily, there are some quality of life things that I've noticed. For example, you can skip certain segments that you've already seen. And all I gotta say is, just learn how to block and counterattack, and whatever you do not get hit or else you'll suffer the same fate as someone who juggles in those Taken games. Since the release, there has been an update in which there's a new mode called Infinite Slash, which is kind of like a boss rush mode where the player will continuously duke it out against whoever or whatever may come your way. Amedama is now available for PlayStation 5, Steam for PC, Nintendo Switch and Xbox Series S and X for $25. I'll provide links so you can pick it up for yourself. And until next time, peace y'all.
And don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit up that notification bell, and I gotta go.